Thank you, Ralph. It's really good to be back. You know, it was, I think, 5, maybe almost 6 years ago that this, whatever this thing is that I do now, started. And it did start here in Brattleboro. Just to give you a little background, prior to coming in contact with some of the information that I'm going to share with you tonight, I was vice president of a Fortune 300 company, had a 5-bathroom house on the coast of Connecticut, had a boat and a slip with twin engines on it. I loved that boat. Today I've got a kayak with a double paddle. That's all you need to know. 2 engines to a double paddle. You know, we're done. So this information I'm going to share with you had a very large, powerful, transformative effect on my life, the life of my family, and as it turns out, on a lot of other people. And so I started out on this journey, and in 2004, when I was in Brattleboro Savings and Loan basement, we were talking about such crazy things as derivatives and the impact those might have on our financial system, a credit bubble that really had me concerned, a housing bubble, a variety of economic pieces that were really pressing at that time that seemed very important. But as Ralph mentioned, I learned something. It's good to be ahead, but not too far. We were a little far ahead then, but I'd rather be a year early than a day late when it comes to stories like this. And so what I'm going to present to you now is really a very small encapsulation of a much larger body of work. That larger body of work is still encapsulated. It's called the Crash Course. It's online. I made it free to the world. I decided, bad business decision, but it was the right moral decision to make it free. And what it does is it explains a lot of information that should have been a flop. It should have been a complete internet flop. 3.5 hours of kind of dense material with a lot of charts and basically no moving pictures. And it took off like wildfire. It was completed in October of 2008. We think it's gotten about 1.5 million views online, but we don't know how many people have downloaded the BitTorrent and burned DVDs and shown them in their communities. But I guess what, maybe 4 weeks ago, maybe 5 weeks ago now, I was out in Northern California where a gentleman had invited me out, said he'd taken the crash course, had shown it to his community. By the time I got in there, he'd done such a good job of using it as an organizing way to get his community involved with a sense of urgency that he filled up an opera house. We had 400 people there. He had to turn away another 50 at the door, and it was the whole community. It was lawyers, it was hippies, it was old, it was young, it was rich, it was poor. The whole community had turned out. So this work has really been my mission for quite a while, and this is why I have this mission. These are my children, and the picture's a little dated. They're a little older than that now. But I really, truly care about creating a world that's worth inheriting. And I think there are some things in our landscape, in our story, in our narrative right now that cause me to question whether we're doing a good job at that or not. I think we're doing a bad job. I care about my country. I care about living in a country that is not bankrupt or insolvent. I consider myself, more importantly, a member of the globe, of the world. And despite everything I'm going to tell you tonight, some people, when they first get in contact with this information, go, ooh, it's a bit of a downer. But I've been through this material long enough, my wife and I have been through this, that we can call ourselves optimists, despite everything we're about to talk about. So this message we're going to talk about tonight is not a message of hopelessness or doom or gloom for me. This is actually a message of change, and this is talking about changes that are going to come whether we wish them to or not. So why not do it on our own terms? This is part of the math you have to learn. There'll be a test at the end. You know, if somebody said, what did he talk about? You say, well, there was 3 E's, there were 2 Q's, and somehow it added up to 1 big P. So let me explain that. The first E is the economy. This is the lens through which I look at everything. I did this in part strategically because I looked around, how can I tell this story? And I found out that you can tell a story through an economic lens. It's not partisan, that doesn't have any sort of religious overtones to it, where I can strip out all of my beliefs. Everybody cares about their pocketbook. It's a way to talk about this story in a way that can engage everybody. But it's also my contention that it's in the economy that we're going to get our first reads on how our system is working or not working. I spent a lot of time watching the markets because they give me very early warning signs, way ahead of the time when you read about it above the fold in the newspaper. Also, the economy is the way we organize ourselves. Without a functioning economy, we are not going to drill 35,000 feet under the ocean for the last oil. We are not going to be driving carbon fiber electric cars unless we have a very complicated manufacturing and distribution system to build those things. In fact, all of our hopes and dreams are pinned on having a functioning economy. Economies, though, run on something. If you don't have energy, all the money in the world doesn't make a bit of difference. And there's an enormous story coming around energy that I think we really deserve to take a very close, hard look at. And then around the environment, here today I'm going to talk about the environment in terms of resources. And when I talk about resources, there are a lot of resources out there that we know are depleting at very fast rates right now. And so when I was giving this talk over in the UK recently, just a few weeks ago, somebody said, "Oh, this isn't the Malthusian argument again, is it? Since he was so wrong, how could it be that you want to dredge that up?" And I said, well, first of all, in order for you to think that Malthus and I are in any way comparable, you have to admit that we had access, him and I, to the same levels of information. We have access to a lot more information today than he did, but also he wasn't wrong. He was early. And as I've learned, you just don't want to be too early. So I look across those three E's, and if I was going to give us a global dashboard, I would say there's red and yellow warning lights all over that dashboard. As prudent adults, we owe it to ourselves to pull over and ask a question, what's going on here? So tonight we're going to have a quick tour through this. Ultimately, what I'm going to show you is the lens. It's how I look at the world. And once I put this lens on, I couldn't take it off. I couldn't see the world any other way. This is why we ended up selling the boat and moving and creating community and taking very concrete actions, because of these three E's formed into this way of looking at the world. It all comes together into this one statement. The next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. And this is critical. Because as humans, we tend to base what we think is about to happen on what just happened. And this is okay for whole periods of time. I'm arguing that there's a corner in the road. There's a corner in the road that would say that basing our projections on what just happened in the past could be a bad way to go about doing this. So here's your second bit of math. This is how economists see the world. Let me simplify that for you. There. That is the economic formula for growth. And if you understood math, you would be able to look at that and say, it's not just any kind of growth, that's exponential growth. This is the type of growth we need in our economy. In fact, it's so deeply embedded in our economic teachings and way of thinking in the current schools of economic thought that dominate our political landscape and our financial landscape, that when we don't have growth, what do we call it when the economy is not growing? Negative growth. That's how deep that term is embedded. So I invite you to watch out for that term as you're reading. You'll see it comes up all the time. We're experiencing negative growth in the job market. You know, what is that? It means, it's just telling you how deeply we are stuck on this concept right here. And everything that we need to understand about why the economy grows the way it does and why we talk about growth, not just any growth, but exponential growth, starts with understanding this stuff. Now, I spend probably 20 or 30 minutes in the crash course talking about it. I'm going to spend 2 minutes on it. So I'm going to have to skip past, and you're going to have to trust me that regardless of what kind of pictures or where these things come from or the quality of the paper stock we printed on, all of these currencies everywhere in the world share one common feature, one thing. They're all the same in this regard. All of them are loaned into existence. It's a powerful statement. What do we know about loans? Well, they have a principal value, and then they have a rate of interest. Principal and interest. This means that because we're loaning all of our money into existence, we are constantly having to pay interest back on all the money we just loaned into existence. That is a recipe for growth, and not just any growth. Exponential growth. And so this is so important. It's a key concept. It means this. It means that we always have more debt than money in our system. Always. If you like empirical data, consider that right now in the United States there's $52 trillion in credit market debt. You can go to the Federal Reserve website, look it up. 52 trillion. How much money is in the system? Well, according to the Federal Reserve, there's around maybe $12 trillion of money. 52 of debt, 12 of money. How do you pay off 52 trillion in debt with 12 in money? It's tricky. Well, hey, there's one of my children. Simon, wave your hand. You thought you were going to sneak in, didn't you? So we have this thing where we always have more debt than money in the system, and it leads to this feature of growth that we just talked about. Because in order for the debts to be serviced, we always have to constantly be loaning new money into existence, and we do it at interest. So we always have more of this. So it creates a machine that grows, and it grows a lot. In fact, we can convert this into a new key concept. We can say that because of our money system, perpetual growth, exponential growth, is actually a requirement of our system. And by requirement, I don't mean legal requirement. It's not written down in a book or in a statute. I mean a requirement like my body requires oxygen. I mean a requirement like if we'd had 2% global growth in 2009, everything would have been okay, more or less. We had 2% negative growth in 2009 worldwide. It was a disaster. Looked like the wheels were falling apart. The whole machine was threatening to go into systemic failure. When I say requirement, that's what I mean. So in this sense, if we don't have a growing money supply, by which I mean a growing credit supply, our economic system becomes unhappy, which is what we just saw in 2009. And if we look at, this is a chart looking at debt to GDP, gross domestic product, over a long time. In the back, this starts in 1925 and comes all the way through to current. And this wiggly yellow line is a ratio of debt to GDP. So on the left axis there, a 200 would mean there's twice as much debt as GDP. If there was $1 trillion in debt, there would be $500 billion in gross domestic product. And we see that there's this little blip back here, and that starts in 1929. This is when this blip starts to go up. And it wasn't because we started taking a lot of debt. Remember, this is a ratio. The debt stayed relatively constant. The GDP fell away from under the debt during the Great Depression. So ignoring that as an anomaly of the Great Depression, we see that we had this very stable relationship with that all the way on up until around the early 1980s. And then something changed. And this yellow line, this has been in existence for my entire adult life. And so to me, this sloping line here, this looks like level territory. This is the world we live in. We did not always live in a world where debt was constantly growing. Our entire country's history prior to early 1980s, that was not the case. So this right here, if we're expecting the next 20 years to be just like the last 20 years, this line has to keep doing that. And that's one way you can just test this material all on your own without going to economics school. You can say, how likely is it that I think we're going to just continue to increase our debt loads at that same rate as we had? Well, there's an implicit assumption baked into debt growth like this. If I loan you money, I have an expectation not only are you going to pay me back the principal, but you're going to pay me back my interest. I'm going to loan you this much and expect more in the future. This is total collective debt across the whole country. So this is 52 trillion. This is personal debt, corporate debt, state debt, federal debt, local debt, all forms of debt. And collectively, we've made this very large bet that the future is not just going to be bigger, but it's going to be a lot bigger, because we're expecting all of this to get paid back. Remember, there's only two ways to get rid of debt. One is to pay it back, and the second is to default on it. So we've made this huge collective bet that the future, the assumption we've made that the future is going to be a lot bigger. So that's the assumption I really want to test. You can put all the lipstick on that pig you want. It's still not a very sanitary story. It's all about the mouth at that age, isn't it? It's not my kid. I didn't take the picture either. And this growth in debt, I just showed you a US picture, but again, from the back, this might be hard to see. This is just showing, we got Germany, Spain, France, Italy, UK, the EU, US, Greece. Where's the US? Here's the US in the green circle. This is showing the little red bars at the bottom, or orange, whatever that color looks like to you. That's the story we tell ourselves about how much debt we're carrying. The gray bars are if we include all the unfunded stuff, the off-balance sheet liabilities, Social Security in our country, Medicare, which are not included in the official story we tell ourselves, but there they are, lurking away. And so these levels of debt now are all across the globe. It was the globe made a collective bet on how the world was going to unfold for the next 20 years. So this is not a US story, this is actually a global story. This economy, then, because of this nature of our money system, I can describe it in just two words. It must grow. That's how it's built. And I'm not here to say if it's good or bad. I'm not here to cast judgments. I'm here to simply describe it, because it's in understanding how the system is formed that we get our predictive power and our ability to make guesses about how things are going to unfold. and that we can use this information then to test against some other pieces of information and make guesses about where we're going. And if there is a sharp corner in the road, being able to illuminate that is the trick. Well, let's talk about this growth. I talked about exponential growth. Most of us are very unfamiliar with it. I've been working with it for years now, and I still don't quite get it. When we say exponential growth, we're talking about something that we're charting, an amount of something over time, and it ends up creating that hockey stick shape. So this is a chart of something that's growing exponentially. And in this particular case, what we're looking at is we're looking at a chart of population. This is an actual chart. It goes back 7,000 years, billions on the left axis there. And we see that things are growing along reasonably, and then all of a sudden it shoots up. And actually, anybody who understands math is saying, oh, he's pulling a fast one on us here, because it turns out that this hockey stick shape is just a function of where this axis is. If I decided to turn that into trillions instead of billions, this would flatten out. Whoop, you wouldn't even be able to see it. It looks like we're still in the flat part. Or if I made this 1 billion instead of 12, it would look like this would slide back here. In short, you can make this curve appear anywhere you want based on how you fiddle on that axis. So actually, you know, it's maybe not that relevant, but it is. It is if you can fix your left axis. If you can say, we reasonably have an expectation, ecologists say, this is about this gray box of rocks up here I put up here. This is about how many people we might be able to put on the Earth's surface safely, given what we know about water, soil, food production, all kinds of other biosystem stresses that might exist. Maybe 9 to 12 billion. So all of a sudden, it's very relevant where we are on this chart. And the fact that we live here on this green part, this red part is the UN projections for the next 42 years, but this green part is all history. So it means we live in a kind of an unusual period of history. Here's oil. We're looking at oil from 1800 through current. And this is how much has been produced, which is how much is consumed. We have some very good information now that we know where to fix the axis on this. Very good information. There was an industry task force on peak oil, came out on February 10th, just before I went over to the UK on the 15th. That was put together by an industry consortium of 5 companies, included Virgin Atlantic with Richard Branson and a couple of energy companies. And they took a look at where we were with respect to oil, and they said, we think that peak oil is going to happen somewhere between 2011 and 13, no matter what we do. That's like tomorrow in terms of this particular story. That is really sudden. So they're taking it very seriously. They just held a closed-door meeting with their major politicians in the UK to talk about how they're going to manage that particular story. And I bet they're talking about managing the story as part of it. So here we are. And being here is very, very different. And here's why. Humans have a really hard time understanding exponential growth. Linear, no problems. Here's an example of exponential, something changing exponentially. If I gave you 2 really large magnets, and I said, I want you to move them together at an even pace from beginning to end, you'll do what every single person on the planet will do, and you'll go, oops. You know, and I'll let you try as many times as you want. Your brain will not be able to calculate that correctly. It'll be really hard. So how can we understand that a little better? And how can we understand what happens when you transition off of this portion to this portion? What does that feel like? So the reason this becomes important for me is that we're just surrounded by all these little exponential charts everywhere. Here's some from the environmental sphere: water use, species extinctions, fisheries, forest loss, all of these things that we've been reading about. We're aware of the fact that we not only live in a world filled with exponential charts, but it feels like things are speeding up. I mean, who here feels like things are really starting to speed up, going faster and faster? There's a reason for that. So let's talk about this miracle of compounding, which gives you an exponential chart. What does that mean? Well, in order to understand this chart a little better, if you've seen this particular exercise, I'm going to zip it, okay? Here's what I'm going to do. I have a magic eyedropper. And it's magic because when I put this drop of water out, this drop of water is going to double every minute. So we take this drop of water out, put it in your hand, and you're looking at it, and a minute goes by, and then you have 2 drops, right? And then another minute goes by, you have 4 drops, a minute goes by, you have 8 drops, and after about 6 minutes, you can fill up a thimble. So follow me. We're going to Wembley Stadium, one of the largest stadiums in the world, and it's my story. So A, it's watertight. B, I've just handcuffed you to the highest row of bleacher seats. Tomorrow, 12 o'clock, I go down onto the pitch and I put one of these magic drops of water down. How long do you have to escape from your handcuffs? Days, weeks, months, years, decades? Hour and a half is one guess?
63 minutes.
63 minutes is another guess? 59 minutes is another guess? Come on, who's thinking days? Anybody?
Is it per second?
Per minute.
Per minute.
There's the question. All right, it turns out you have 50 minutes to escape. 50 minutes. And if it turns out I was off in my calculations by 100%, think 1251 in your mind. I don't care. What time is this giant stadium still 97% empty space, and how many of you realize the seriousness of your predicament? 12:45. You're handcuffed, you wait 45 minutes, have a hot dog, you got a beer going, there's a little bit of water on the pitch. 45 minutes, 3% fills up, 5 more minutes, all done. That's the power of compounding. Things start out relatively slowly and then they move very quickly. And the reason this is relevant, even though this looks like that's kind of a joke, kind of a way of explaining this, it's not. Because the stadium has a fixed space. And because of that, it's a little bit like our Earth. There's certain finite things we can talk about. All right. So here we are back on our oil consumption curve. And back here we had oil shock 1, early 70s. Jimmy Carter comes out and says, actually he's got this great speech that he gave in the early 70s, where he basically laid out the actual challenges we're facing today. And he gave that talk. We elected a different president. We had Morning in America. And then 30 some odd years passed, and then we had another oil shock. The mistake in this story would be to think that because we had 30 years, we have another 30 years after this shock, because we're on fundamentally different parts of this curve. The water in the stadium is in completely different places. We have a very different story on our hands at this point in time. So this is why, using our past example of saying, well, we had an oil shock, we'll just take a little time. You know, we had another one, that's okay. But these were also fundamentally different. This oil shock was geopolitical in nature. This one was a little bit geological in nature. This oil shock, when we hit $147 a barrel on July of 2008, we had seen something we'd never seen in the data series before. Out of the 6 prior quarters of looking at supply and demand, in 5 of those, supply had been exceeded by demand. We'd never seen that before. So this was a very different oil shock. Yeah, we're blaming speculators, but those speculators were looking at some pretty interesting information about supply and demand. All right, so these exponential charts are everywhere. I can show you literally hundreds of them. But the really important concept I want to get across here is that because we don't live in a linear world, we live in this speeding up part, right? We had 45 minutes for 3% and then just 5 minutes for the remaining parts. It took all of human history to 1960 to put 3 billion people on the planet. It took another 40 years to put the next 3 billion people on the planet. So where we are today is fundamentally different from where we were even when I was born into this world 47 years ago. Now I want to define the difference between problems and predicaments, which is a nice piece of framing that John Michael Greer had provided to the world, and I love this one. So a problem has solutions. A predicament only has outcomes. Here's the difference. If you're a climber, forgive me, this is a very inaccurate picture, but these two gentlemen have a problem on their hands. There's a variety of solutions. Somebody could lower a rope, they could put a big crash pad under there, maybe the guy climbs on. There are ways to reverse their situation to get back to their original condition. This guy has a predicament on his hands. No matter how hard he pinwheels his arms, he's not going back to the top. He's going to get wet. So he's got to manage that outcome. Is he going to land on his feet, or is he going to belly flop? Big difference, right? But this is the difference between having a problem and having a predicament. So with that framing in mind, I want to carry that idea forward. So let's look at energy, because here I believe we've got a predicament on our hands. This is a chart of US oil production and dependency. First, the production, going back from the 20s to current. This is a chart of how much oil came out of the ground, barrels on the left there. So we peaked at just under 10 million barrels per day in the early 1970s. And since that time, we've done all kinds of exploring, and we've done some very fancy things, and we've used the best technology and recovery techniques in the entire world, and we've done them very aggressively, and we produce about half the oil today that we did at our peak. That's something that we're not going to solve with a lot of wishful thinking. It's just something we have to manage, and here's how we manage it currently. This orange wedge is how much we import. We import about 2/3 of our petroleum needs on a daily basis. So this is something that we absolutely require that we can get from the rest of the world. But there is nothing that we're going to do in our current energy situation, as we understand geology today, to fill this gap from domestic sources. So when we look at this chart, there's something very important about how oil gets produced. When we first start producing oil, you stick that little, look, there you can actually see a person there, and there's a drilling rig. So it's maybe a 70-foot drilling rig. And oil shoots out under pressure. And then later on, we end up with these things. They're called stripper wells. And all I really care, I'm not going to talk about oil. What I care about is that as we start to produce more and more oil, one thing we can say is that oil's cheaper every step of the way. Every next barrel we pull out is just cheaper and cheaper. And then you go past the peak of production in an oil field, in a collection of oil fields, in an entire country, or in a globe, doesn't matter. After the peak, things become more expensive. So you've heard about these amazing finds recently, right? They did say, yeah, there's this huge find. 35,000 feet under the floor of the Gulf of Mexico was announced. Same as if you took a drilling rig, put it on the top of Mount Everest, went all the way to sea level, and went another mile. It's a long way. It's not trivial. I can tell you for a fact that's more expensive oil than this stuff with a 70-foot drill rig that's shooting this geyser out that they had a hard time capping. It's fundamentally different. All right, this was the chart that shocked me a lot. This comes from the International Energy Agency, came out in fall of 2008. And up to 2008, that's from 2007 all the way prior, the International Energy Agency is tasked with doing one thing, assessing global supply and global demand. That's their job. And prior to 2008, they'd always said, well, this is how much we're burning today, and we'd like our economy to grow by that much, so how much oil will we have in 20 years? That much. Literally, that was their process. 2008, they did it different. They actually went out and said, oh, let's add up all the oil fields in the world, which they did, and summed them all up, and actually looked at them in a big spreadsheet and said, how much do we have? And they said, ooh, first thing they did was before, in 2007, they said that we were going to have oil available to us that would be 130 million barrels per day. And they dialed that all the way back to 105. It was an enormous, enormous downgrading of the amount of oil we'd have. But the really shocking thing, this big blue part on the bottom is crude oil from currently producing fields. That's a euphemism for cheap and easy. Currently producing is the stuff we've already found. It already has drill rigs, has infrastructure, has pipes, it flows. Here we are in 2009 when they released that, and they admitted that we are past peak of conventional oil. That's okay, we're going to find all this other stuff, right? These are crude oil from fields yet to be developed, natural gas liquids, non-conventional oil, that's that really deep stuff I just talked about. And then this red wedge, crude oil from fields yet to be found. That's a fat wedge. It's the fattest wedge up there of the new stuff. So they made this admission, though, that we were past cheap and easy. Cheap and easy. And this has enormous implications for the quantity of oil. Because oil can't really be overestimated. It's how we move literally almost all of our products from point A to point B. We use it for transportation mainly. 70% of all oil consumed is consumed to move stuff. The other 30% is used to make stuff. Plastics, fertilizers, you name it. So we don't have a substitute for those liquid fuels at this point. We do not have one yet. We have ideas, we don't have one. So this actually was really shocking that we're past conventional oil. And the task force, the industry task force, they come up with their own estimate of where we're going to peak out. They did the same sort of a bottoms-up analysis, and they thought that we were going to have somewhere around 95 million barrels per day as a peak flow rate, total peak quantity of oil coming out of the ground at 95. Well, that means that somewhere by 2013 or 15, somewhere in that zone, the world economy will no longer have all the oil at once. You know how it solves that, right? Makes prices shoot up. But this will be the first time in human history that we will actually have less oil available to us than we want, or less energy available to us. It's a big phase transition. It's a big change, huge change. So quantity is an issue. But there's an even more important story that's lurking out there, which is very rarely told, and it relates to this. Let's forget about how much money it costs to get oil or any energy out of the ground. Forget about it. I mean, we print money out of thin air, so is it 10 million a barrel or 10 cents? Think about it this way. think about the energy we have to invest to get energy. So if you're a farmer, you know all about this, right? Like how much of my personal energy am I going to put in growing food? And what you're going to hope is that you get more energy back out of that process than you put in, because otherwise you're out of business. Here, what we're looking at is a hypothetical chart of how much energy would we get out, given how much energy we had to put in. Again, dollars don't matter. So all the way on that end of the chart, we see a 50 down there. It means that we put 1 barrel of oil into the equation, we got 50 back. 1 in, 50 back. And what's great about that is that this red part is the energy we had to invest in. The green, hey, we do whatever we want with that. When you get 50 units back, we only have to put 1 back in to get more. Do what you want. So this becomes the surplus energy that is available to society. This is where we get our complexity from. This is where all of our social richness and our economic richness comes from, having a lot of green territory under here. Does that make sense? And as we notice, there's something funny happens as we move from 50 to 1 to 40 to 30 to 20, that this chart isn't slowly falling off in a nice linear way that we would be able to intuitively understand. It's moving non-linearly. Everything's fine for a while, and then whoomph, it falls off, and it crosses at 1. And it crosses at 1 because by the time you're putting 1 barrel in to get 1 barrel out, you're spinning your wheels. So nothing happens here. There's no surplus available at that point. So it crosses at 1 and is non-linear. Well, in the 30s, when we first, that oil rig I showed you with the stuff shooting out the top, we were actually getting 100 to 1 returns back in the 30s. And then by the 70s, we were probably getting 25 to 1 returns. Qualitatively, almost the same. Look at all that green territory under there. Awesome. Then in the 90s, somewhere between 10 and 18 to 1. And we think today, with those 35,000 foot deep things, we might be getting 3 to 1 returns. Well, given that the green is where we run our economy and where we run our society from, this actually becomes a bit of a concern. So if we had to run our society just on current fields we were finding, and this was true, we were only getting 3 to 1, we live in that world. Not that one, this one. Oops, a lot less green stuff. And if we were going to run our entire society in the US on corn-based ethanol, which has a net energy return of maybe 1.5, we'd be trying to cram our whole society into that space right there. It's just not energetically a wise thing to do. It might make good political sense, the farmers might like it, it might even make economic sense. But from an energy standpoint, it makes absolutely no sense because we would not be able to run our current society on that particular fuel source. So then, let's call that quality. It's the quality of the energy. You've heard perhaps that there's 3 Saudi Arabias locked in the Rocky Mountains. Technically true, but the energy return on that stuff is abysmal. In fact, it might be below 0. We don't know. We've never commercially been able to make it work at this point. So I want you to think about the quality of the resource as well. So now we have this economic system based on our money supply type that must grow, and it's connected over here to an energy system which we have some serious adult-sized concerns maybe can't grow. And this has enormous implications. We do not have any historical period where we can look back and say, how did we manage such a transition before on a global scale? We don't have that information. Quantity and quality, very important. And we can tell this same story, I'll tell this very quickly around the environment. Here's 2 gentlemen, back when cameras were, I guess, just almost first invented. And they're sitting on copper nugget. This is what we were finding lying around this incredible nation when we got here and we started our industrialization of this country. And after we ran out of those, and that went by pretty quick, we moved on to the smaller nuggets because that's what we do, right? You go from best to next goodest. And then, we're onto the copper ores. That's beautiful stuff at 10%. And today, this is what we're doing. This is the Bingham Canyon mine. This used to be a mountain. It's now a hole, 3/4 of a mile deep, 2.5 miles across. And we're pulling out ore grades out of that at the bottom that are 0.2%. And we're not doing that because we'd like to give our engineers challenges. It's like, oh, go for the really hard stuff. We're doing this because this is the next best stuff left, right? So forget about the cost of copper. Forget if it's $1 a pound or $4 a pound or whatever. Think about the energy it takes to make a hole like that. I want you to put your energy hat on. Think about what it takes to fill up a 250-ton truck at the bottom and whoop, drive it all the way out, and then crush all of that ore and turn it into some copper. Well, we can basically say we start with the big nuggets and we extract those, and we move on to the lesser ones, and then we move to the lesser ores, and finally we're at the bottom, and we can find that just as oil has a peak, all resources that are finite ultimately have a peak. And it matters a lot because it turns out that the amount of energy it's required as you move down this curve is not linear. It grows non-linearly. It explodes. And alongside that are the costs. But it's really the energy that matters in this story. So we have a generalized resource extraction profile. And now collectively we can say, well, we have this economy which we love. It gives us all of our social richnesses, but it must grow. And it's connected to this energy system. We're worried maybe it can't grow. And we've got a story that I could tell you about dozens of key minerals that we know are depleting. And they're depleting at nonlinear rates. They're depleting very, very rapidly. Hey, maybe they'll last another 10 years or another 20 or maybe 40. But in terms of human evolution, it's a blink of an eye. In terms of my children's life, even the rest of my lifetime, it's a blink of an eye. And so it raises some pretty profound questions there. In both of these stories, then, quantity and quality, both of those are critical elements of this story. And when I put all of this together and I look at this and I say, well, is this a problem? Meaning, are we going to tweak this with a couple of policy changes, maybe elect somebody new in, just minor, relatively minor changes, or is this a predicament? Meaning, we're going to have to entertain the concept of some very non-status quo solutions to this particular arrangement of constellation of difficulties. So this is convergence to me. There's a lot here that I've left out. There's an enormous quantity on the economy itself. We can talk about total levels of debt. We can talk about demographics. We can talk about failure to invest. There's a variety of things, but all of these things converge. And they're going to, just the economic pieces alone, have enormous questions as to how we're going to manage those. But when we toss the other two E's on there, all of these things are going to be demanding our attention. They're going to be demanding our resources. And so when I ask this question, can the economy as we know it survive resource depletion? Well, it really depends on what your definition of survive is. It's my contention that our current style of economy, the way it's been growing, the way it's been operating for the past 20, 25, even we could say the industrial period, past 200 years, is not going to be able to survive in the sense that it will continue as is. It'll transition and it'll be growing in some new way, but not in the old way. So that's my main hypothesis around that piece, and it raises, here's the equation again. I put colors on it so you could remember it better. There were 3 yellow E's, 2 green Q's, and this big red P. So just remember that, the economy, energy, the environment. I want you to think not just about how much we've got, but the quality of it. What's its concentration? How useful is it to us? All potentially leading to this concept of having a predicament that we need to manage. So here's the question then. What do we do? Oh, I have to end my talk here. No, just kidding. So what do we do? The first thing is, I truly believe this is, I think the word paradigm and changing paradigms gets overused. I'm using it like I actually mean it. I think this is a changing of paradigms, and it's really profound. Here's an old paradigm. We're going to have more energy each year. In fact, we don't even have to think about it. It'll cost more. Maybe we have to send more ships to the Middle East to protect it or something. But the old paradigm just assumed that we're going to have more energy each year. And I think we're going to have to face a new paradigm where we might have to think about how we manage and arrange ourselves with less energy each year. Peak oil is not running out. It just means having slightly less. You saw that chart where we peaked in the 70s. Well, it's 40 years ago. We didn't run out, but we do have about half as much as we did 40 years ago coming out of the ground in this country. So we're going to have slightly less and less energy each year. And that's okay if we're looking at the problem or the predicament and we're managing it. If we're trying to pretend that it's just not there and we're ignoring it, maybe that's not true. Maybe we do have a sort of a giant problem with it. The old paradigm says, well, we have more resources each year, more copper, more food, more fish, more timber, more everything. Maybe we have a new paradigm where we have actually fewer resources each year flowing through our economy. In the old paradigm, we pretty much more or less had reliable economic growth every year. In the new paradigm, we might have reliable economic shrinkage every year. So think about this. If you accept the hypothesis that oil runs the economy, and we saw in 2009 that the world economy shrank by a couple percent, but so did oil use. And a lot of that was economic in nature, but still, when we saw that energy not flowing through the world economy, we got less economy out of it, right? Well, when we get to a geological oil shock, then we might be in a position where we're going to see the amount of oil available to us be shrinking by 3% if we're lucky, 6 or 7% if we're not lucky every year. So what would it feel like with, to average it out, what would it feel like with 5% less energy flowing through the world economy every year? I submit it would probably feel like 2009, again and again and again. It'll feel like a string of them. And that's something that we can absolutely avoid if we can see it in time, and we can start to restructure ourselves, and we can make the appropriate investments. But this is something that's an absolutely fantastically large risk. And the implication for all of this for me is that we absolutely need non-status quo solutions or intelligent responses or ways of managing our outcomes as we go forward. We absolutely have to start entertaining the idea that we can't tweak our way out of this one. This is going to require a substantial change, a pretty big change. The good news is that I think we have everything we need to do it, except maybe the right framing and the right story and the right political will at this point. But we don't need new technology. We've got it. It'd be nice, don't get me wrong, I love new technology when it comes, but we don't need it today. We know how to do things a lot more effectively than we're currently doing them, more efficiently. To me, it's all about getting the story right. You know, well before we had written word, we were all sitting around campfires telling stories. Stories is how we conduct ourselves. So here's an example. We had this story, stop me if you've heard it, ran up to about 2005 or 6, depending on your location, that went like this. Houses always go up in price. That was the story. It was repeated endlessly. In the airwaves, it was told to us by trusted financial advisors. Wall Street was going crazy with it. Your neighbors were doing it. Everybody believed it. Turned out it was the wrong story. A lot of bad decisions happened. We're going to live with the economic pain of that for a long time because we had the wrong story. What if we had a story in play up to 2005 that went like this? Sometimes houses go up in price, sometimes they lose a lot. Whole different ballgame. So the question is, what stories do we have playing right now that are similarly blinding us because we just accept them as, oh, no, I know this one's true, right? One of those stories for me is that the economy always has to grow. That's a story. It's repeated in ways both large and small, subtle and sophisticated in our daily media experience. And I question as to whether that is actually the right story to be telling ourselves. Is one example. I no longer see this particular piece of work I do, in fact I haven't for a long time, is about left versus right. It's not about old versus young. It's not about this versus that. It's now about something much more profound than that. I think we're down to the point where we're now going to be measuring whether we've made the right choices or whether we've made the wrong choices. Remember, if the water in the stadium's all the way down in the infield, you have time to make some bad decisions. When the water's all the way coming up the stairs, you have a lot less time to make bad decisions. So what I'm arguing here is that the types of decisions we're going to be making today, that you are going to be making in the next few years, are much more important than they've ever been. We live at a very critical time where making right decisions can make all the difference in the world. Making the wrong decisions can also make all the difference in the world. The work then that I see that needs to happen, this is what I've been doing, is to first raise awareness. So the crash course, this thing I'm doing, this is about raising awareness around the set of issues. But awareness is not enough. Like if I'm driving down the road and my engine light comes on and I pull over and I don't know how my engine works and I start going to solutions myself there on the side of the road, probably going to make things worse, not better. So we start with simple awareness, and it takes time to deepen that into actual understanding, to really sit down and wrestle with the issues of how these 3 E's come together, or within any one of these E's. We're going to have to broaden our understanding before we really move into the big stuff, what we might call solutions or intelligent responses. I don't believe we have enough of this yet in our halls of power to really be doing this right. It is my argument that a lot of the solutions that were affected in a moment of awareness that we had a financial crisis were the wrong solutions. I've been arguing this for a long time. Throwing hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions, at the very same people who created the mess without requiring them to change their behavior was a bad solution. That's my opinion. So this is the work as I see it. And we need a vision. We need a national narrative that makes sense. Cash for clunkers doesn't make sense for me. It's a story, but it's not enough. Swapping out a couple of cars so we can get a few extra miles per gallon is not in accordance with what I know to be true, as far as the data tells me about peak oil and where we really are in the energy curve. We need a national narrative that talks about how we're going to go from here to there, we need to even know where there is. I don't believe there includes getting our consumer-led economy spooled up and back consuming as fast as possible again, because that's the status quo road. We go down that road, and I think when we do, we might find that that has a disappointing ending to it. I think there's a larger crisis waiting down that road, because I have this framework. So who's going to paint that vision? Who's going to do that? And this is still missing largely at the national level, and in that vacuum, in my work, I have the pleasure of going to communities all over America and now the world to see that people are painting these visions. There are transition town movements and concerned people pulling together and asking their own questions about where we want to go. And the good news in that story is that means people reclaiming responsibility in their community for how the future is going to unfold, to the extent they can. Right? You control what you can, but none of us in this room doing, no matter how incredible the work is here in Brattleboro, are going to change a global energy situation. That's outside of our control, but people are painting this vision locally at community levels, and to me that's where the great hope in this story is, because I get to see this happening, and it's happening in our own lives. We're doing this in our corner of the world down in Montague, painting this vision, working with people, saying, there might be this huge change coming, we don't know when, we might be all wrong about it, but what could we do to increase the resilience in our own lives that will allow us to step into that future if it comes with greater equanimity, maybe a little bit more resilience than if we hadn't undertaken these particular steps. And along the way, we discovered something really important. We cut our standard of living in half, and we probably doubled our quality of life. There's a whole story here which says we have an opportunity now to examine where we are and where we're going. And that's an important, exciting thing that we should not waste. We're wasting this crisis at the national level. We're failing, perfectly good crisis, just throwing it away. We have this immense opportunity to learn from this and ask questions about where we're going. And so I'm seeing that at the local level. I'm seeing that in rooms like this, and so that's my great hope. And it's been fun. It's been challenging. And I want to thank you for your attention here today. It's been fun. Right, so the question was about how important is it that we refashion our monetary system. It's critical, absolutely critical. I look at money now, it's a very important social contract. It's the way we organize ourselves. If a few digits show up somewhere, a giant ship gets loaded and goes across the ocean and great things happen. We need a functioning money system, but I'm of the opinion now that having just one is not a very ecologically sound principle. That all good, resilient systems have multiple ways of managing different flows of energy. So let's pick a wetlands. If you take the canal and you line it with concrete, you find yourself dry and flooded pretty regularly, and there's not a lot of in between. Instead, we want wetlands and estuaries. So I would love to see multiple currencies come in. I wouldn't advocate, let's trash this one and start another one, because I don't think there is any magic currency. Each one enforces some behaviors, punishes others. Some of them aren't even money, as you would recognize it. One of the systems I love hearing about is in Japan. They have a very strong cultural tradition of taking care of their elders, their parents. And the problem is that a lot of people no longer work in the same town where their parents live. So somebody started a time bank system where you would go and take care of some elderly people in your town, bank that, and then somebody would take care of your parents. And so this is showing how a system of value exchange is operating without money that fits into the culture. And without that piece there, they would have a less resilient system, because trying to operate that whole same transaction with just money is going to be a lot more difficult. In fact, it won't work for everybody. So I think that we need multiple currency systems. And that way, if one starts to really fail, you've got the other ones that you can fall back on. And so I would see them as sort of living and breathing, expanding, contracting. They should be vibrant and alive, just like the economy that they're trying to serve. So at this point, I absolutely would not advocate just taking the Fed out back and behind the woodshed and taking some bats to it. I think we need to investigate ways that we can augment our monocrop, if you will, of money at this point in time with other ones.
You mentioned that you look to the markets as a kind of signal at times. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I watch the markets very closely because they tell me months ahead of time when we're coming to a turning moment. One of the things that I'm very concerned about, so I'll tell you one example of what I'm looking for. I'm very concerned about the fact that my government ran a 12% deficit to GDP last year, which is total banana republic territory. Like if anybody, Greece is running 8%. Look how the world's yelling at them, right? 12%, whoops, you know, a lot worse. And we're going to run 10 or 11% deficit to GDP this year. And that level of fiscal recklessness is being matched by a level of monetary recklessness on behalf of the Federal Reserve, on behalf of the banking system, who poured almost $1.5 trillion of new, freshly minted credit, which I think will turn into money ultimately straight into the banking system. Those two things together tell me that we're coasting along and everybody's okay, but what I would worry about is if that suddenly doesn't become okay. Markets have this habit of everything being fine for a while and then whoops, they change. You know, the school of fish suddenly goes left and nobody can tell you why. So what I'm worried about, that school of fish, is that I'm worried that our dollar, our currency is going to have a crisis potentially at some point. And I think we're going to detect that by some large country, maybe China, or somebody suddenly losing faith in that story and taking the ball and going home, right? Well, what would that, how would we detect that? Well, first we would see the dollar start to decline. But what would tell us that they were doing something really important is China holds a lot of our treasuries. They would have to sell those, take those in dollars, sell those dollars, and take that money home if that's how they were going to do it. So what I watch for is I watch for interest rates and the dollar as a pair of things that I stand over. If the dollar goes down a lot but interest rates stay constant, I don't care. If interest rates go up a lot but the dollar goes up like it just did yesterday and the day before, But if the dollar starts to go down and interest rates start to go up, that tells me that the game has shifted. And at that point, lots of things are going to shift very quickly. So that would change what I do, what I write about, maybe purchase decisions, where I keep my money. All kinds of things hinge off of that particular set of market events. And I think that what we'll see is I would detect that in that pair of market pieces probably several weeks before they actually talked about it openly. There would be explanations, there would be relative levels of getting the story wrong in the media. All of those things would be designed to buy time. And so what I found is that I was able to spot a lot of the transitions that have happened over this past year well before they actually happened. 2008, I saw that coming several weeks in advance because I was watching credit spreads and they were blowing up. And next thing you know, then 2 weeks later, we had this crash in the market and the wheels came off. So there's signs like that I've learned to read. And it's funny, there are millions of eyeballs out there, very self-interested eyeballs, trading those markets very actively. And so in a sense that, it's kind of like having a Reuters news feed, but it's faster in some respect.
Hey, Chris,
Mm-hmm.
take a question from downstairs, from the Skyping audience downstairs.
Yes.
The question is democracy capable of dealing with depletion? The political system has a hard time dividing up a pie that's getting smaller.
Is democracy capable of dealing with depletion? I think democracy is actually really good in crises. It's a little bit less good up to the crisis. And so my concern in this particular story is that democracy itself is very incentivized to sort of keep the status quo, preserve the status quo, and we'll do that right up to the point where it's too late. And that's a story that I don't know really is going to work very well given the magnitude of this story. And so here's an example. For the past 3 years, I've been tracking what China's been doing, mostly just through news stories. But there's this whole constellation of things that I've put together that says, it looks like China has a policy. And the way you find out about this policy is you find out that CNOC, one of their national oil companies, just had a big oil contract that they put down with Argentina last week. They did the same thing with Venezuela about 3 months ago. They've done it with West Africa about 5 months ago. They did it with Iran recently and a year ago. And all of a sudden you start to put the story together and you find out that the national oil companies from China have been busy buying up all the oil they can. And they've been buying up all the farmland they can. And they've been buying up all the timber rights they can. They just bought a whole valley in Afghanistan, which is not very amenable to industry right now, paying $1 billion more than anybody else for the rights to this valley because it's the last largest copper deposit on the face of the planet that's known about. And when we put all these things together, it looks like somebody has laced up their shoes and is running down a track that's labeled resource scarcity. And my country, as far as I can tell, has only barely started talking about this at the very lowest committee level, way off in the fringes of the halls of power. So we don't even have our shoes on. Might not even know there's a race going on, right? We'll figure it out, but China's been carefully preparing this for years. The difference in this story is that China has the benefit, if you will, of being an autocratically, centrally controlled government that can look at a story like this and pull some levers and make it happen. Democracy is harder because this is something that takes a lot longer to get that story percolating from DC through all the halls of power and business and everything. So I think China has an advantage in that particular story, but it's just phenomenal to see what they've been doing. They're playing a very different game than we are at this point in time with respect to resources. So yeah, China takes it seriously, and I'm sure somebody does in our government, but I have not detected it yet at the public face of that in the news stories that I can read about where we're putting our priorities and what's important to us. So I think that's an example in my mind where democracy is a little bit behind the ball. And that's not just the US. I judge Europe's in about similar situations with respect to that same story. So it doesn't look like the Western world at this point is really out of the gate on that one. So two pieces in there. The first question was around, since the United States has $52 trillion in debt and only $5 trillion of that's held by foreigners directly through treasury bonds. Foreigners actually hold a lot more in corporate debt, other forms as well, but call it 10 trillion total. The question is, well, if we owe that to ourselves, can't we just sort of, write it down and say we don't owe it? It's a really sticky story because, when we get down to it, we find out, well, who's holding that debt, right? Well, it's pensions. So which pensions are we going to say, I'm sorry, is it the California teachers? Is it retired auto workers? Who is it? So pensions, and then it's also the endowments for colleges hold a large portion of that. A lot of so this is really held all over the place. So thinking about how we would fairly sort of approach that problem of giving everybody a haircut, it's a possibility, but I predict it wouldn't be that easy. There would be a lot of issues with that. First of all, it would be completely illegal under our contract law. So we'd have to rewrite some laws. Maybe amend the Constitution. There'd be some stuff. Right. But when we look at this 52 trillion, and you made the point that the United States uses resources relatively efficiently and effectively, and it's got a very dynamic economy. It does. China's total, we look at the US, what is it, 6% of the world's population consuming roughly 25% of the world's energy. China flipped that, almost a quarter of the world's population, and they're consuming a fraction of what we're consuming, but they're coming up really, really fast. And so if we look forward, what I see in that story is that if China, and they're on an angle, they say, we want to be just like Westerners. We want our people to enjoy that same level of prosperity. They're going to discover that there's just not enough resources in that story for all of us to do that, to enjoy that. And so the question is, how does that piece start to resolve? China has been handed the keys to our kingdom. They do own about $1 trillion of our debts at this point in time. And so it's really up to them to decide if some Tuesday morning they want to start unloading those or not. If we're thinking about, what's the most classic reason that nations go to war in history? Resources, right? Failed harvest here, tribes go over there, et cetera, so forth. And so this next war that we're going to fight over resources, because it's pretty much a lock guarantee that we'll have one, doesn't have to be a shooting war. It could be a financial war. It could be a trade war. It could be all kinds of different ways that could potentially unfold. I desperately want to avoid the shooting war story on this one. I really think that would be a tragic mistake and very unfortunate. But it's a possibility if it turns out we decide we're going to have to go head-to-head with China on this particular thing. So I look at the 52 trillion that's sitting in America, and I ask the question, what kind of an economy would we need in order to service that at current rates? Meaning a dollar is worth $1 today, it's worth roughly $1 tomorrow when we decide to pay it all back. And that story is one that I've had a really hard time reconciling it. I can only find one way out of this. It's the oldest way in the book. We have 60 historical examples where other governments have gotten in similar trouble in history, and they've all chosen one route. And it's called printing, or its electronic equivalent. Printing, I don't mean actual physical paper dollars. We don't use those. We make electronic registry entries. But it's the same thing. And that's a story that we've actually been pursuing we have 2 years now of printing under our belt. We've been doing it for 2 years. And the question is, how much more are we going to do? And what's that going to look like? And are we going to be able to stop that printing? And if we don't, we run a very high risk, not a guarantee, but a high risk of really damaging our currency in that process. So tie that over to somebody like China. I see in China's interest, they're probably just watching this whole thing going, they're on a track to potentially take themselves out of this game. And that's okay with their particular strategy at this point. They're a big country, they're dynamic, they have just an enormous quantity of people, and the resource story is really the important piece to that angle. Do I think we're undergoing inflation or deflation? Yes. And it's not really a totally flip answer. I don't see, this is one of the hardest questions. This is one that gets debated a lot out there, and it's neither, in my mind. If we look at the symptom of it, and we said inflation is rising prices and deflation is falling prices, we can see examples of both out there right now. The biggest mistake that the Federal Reserve made under Greenspan was an intellectual mistake that was so colossal it was unbelievable. He failed to look at rising asset prices as a form of inflation. He said the only form of inflation that we're going to count here as important is consumer price inflation, which is basically looking at the things you buy plus a few services. But he left out houses, he left out stocks, he left out bonds. Well, when we say we have too much money in society and that creates inflation, it does create inflation. Some of it goes off into cotton, but some of it goes into bonds, and some goes into, so we had this enormous mistake where we were not treating asset inflation as insidious a problem as it really turned out to be. And now we're living with the impact of that. The Federal Reserve is doing everything it possibly can to avoid deflation. Deflation, if it really takes hold and becomes a large problem, is a self-reinforcing spiral that will just destroy the country. And they're absolutely right to be fighting it. How they're going about doing it, I think, is maybe open to question. But what they're trying to prevent is a situation where if Citibank fails and all of the debts they're holding go bad, and then they can't pay their people, and so the people who are holding those debts can't pay other people, it becomes a domino effect, and all these companies and all these institutions fall. And it becomes a self-reinforcing spiral until all that debt's washed out. That's an enormously painful process. History says that all bubbles, whether they're tulip bulb bubbles like happened in the 1700s in Holland, or whether it's a stock bubble like we saw in the 90s and early 2000s, or whether it's a housing bubble like we just saw, or an even larger credit bubble. Remember that chart with that yellow line going whoop that I circled in red? That's a credit bubble. If that bubble cracks like every other bubble we've studied historically, we have 70 examples to look at, it means that where that bubble started is how far we have to go before it's unwound. It means that, here's a simple way to look at this. In 2000, we had total credit market debt in the US of 26 trillion in 2000. By 2008, we had 52 trillion. Remember how things speed up at the end? We doubled our total level of debt in this country. So if we just said, 2000 is when the bubble started, well, if it's like any other bubble, it'll go up and then it'll come back. It means that we have to lose about $26 trillion in debt to get back to baseline, which will mean we're about $20 trillion away from telling the story to its finish and its conclusion. That's what the Fed's fighting. And the battle they have to fight is they're dumping money in fast enough to prevent this thing from just sort of going pop. And the knife edge they're walking in this story is that if they do that just a little too fast, or foreigners lose confidence in that story, they'll push us into inflation, if not hyperinflation, very, very rapidly. This is a very delicate, dangerous piece that they're walking at this point. And this is one of the things that really drives me just a little bit nuts about our financial machinery in New York Times or anybody else who's reporting on these inflation, deflation stories. They're not talking about the true risks that we're facing, that this is a time when they're doing their best, they're just people, they've studied the Great Depression, they're trying everything they can, but if they get it wrong, this is what we face. And so we're not really talking about the risks that we're running in this experiment. In my mind, it's almost 90% sure that they're going to win or err on the side of inflation. Deflation is such a horrible outcome that they'll do anything they can to avoid it. And they haven't even begun, right? You know, in one sense. They've given a couple trillion to the big banks. But if this thing really goes down harder, I predict that they'll do more than give us cash for clunkers, $8,000 home tax credits, other stuff. You'll find a check in your mailbox from the Federal Reserve that you have to spend by next Tuesday, you know, or something. There's a lot of things they haven't tried yet, but they will go to that route to prevent this from just going pop, because I just guarantee you that that's not a direction they want to go in. But there's a small chance that they could lose that battle despite their best efforts, and it does go pop. So it's a very delicate period we're in right now. That's why I constantly say we are not out of the woods on this story yet. It's best to stay alert, aware, watching the markets, whatever you need to do to stay on top of this, because we're not in recovery, as I see it. So, well, see, the part that's really troubling about this story is that if we take oil out of the picture, the estimates say that we could support maybe a third of the current population. Forget about additional growth. For every calorie you eat, 10 calories of oil is embedded in that story, right? That's a very different equation from once upon a time. when there might be 2 calories of muscle energy sort of baked in there if we included draft animals and things like that. So we're in a situation where we are actually drawing down our oil reserves as though it was a principal bank account in order to buy food, if we want to look at it that way. And so in this story, oil is so critical to food production at this point in time that I think we deserve really good answers about how we're going to manage this transition as we go forward into this next stage. This story isn't going to get told equally across the globe either. The United States is in a very fortunate position, as is Canada, with respect to food production. Other countries aren't quite as lucky. And so in this next story, as I see it, if we, here's the win the battle, lose the war story that I have in my head. We dump $10 trillion into the global economy, things come out, we tell ourselves the story that we're back in recovery, everybody goes back to buying, all is well, and we run into an actual supply shortfall in oil production. And this is different. This is the one where actual nations look out and go, oh wait, you mean this is geologically, that's it? What we would predict at that point is what's called resource nationalization. Countries would say, you know what, we don't feel like exporting our oil so much anymore. Maybe Norway. Maybe Colombia, maybe Venezuela, maybe Mexico say, oh, we actually need this for our own internal uses at this point. We could see a very dramatic drop-off in global exports, which would mean for countries like ours that have that huge orange wedge of imports that I described, would suddenly experience very sharply rising oil prices, which would translate very rapidly into an economic crisis, just like the last one in 2008, was triggered a little bit by oil prices, which would rapidly translate itself into a food crisis. So I think we could see that series of dominoes as one potential scenario that would all be triggered by us running at high rate of velocity into the next oil depletion story in a couple of years. And that's something that I'm watching very carefully. I chew through the oil data on a weekly basis, just watching it, trying to figure out what's going on. It's a tricky story because I don't know that we have great data. But in that story, food and population are always looming as critical elements. And it's something that I know we can manage reasonably well if we get the right bit to that story. But if we choose to ignore it and just do the whole status quo, get us back to a growth path as fast as possible, that's a story that I think could end reasonably in some disappointment on that subject. Unfortunately, scaring is a part of this story. And it's not one that I undertake because I want to. It's part of the story. And what it really reflects is that what this, 3 years ago I had a blinding insight. For me it was an insight. Up to 3 years ago I thought I was in the business of sharing information. And I suddenly realized I was actually in the business of challenging beliefs. And once I got that shift in my head, I was able to be a lot more effective with this story. Because really when our primary beliefs get challenged, the first thing that comes up is an emotional wall. Sometimes it's anger. Sometimes it's just a very strong emotional response. And if ultimately this story says, and this was the hardest part, I say there's 3 big areas that I've worked on in my own life. I've made financial changes, I've made physical changes in terms of how I grow food and certain things I've done and relationships I have in town, and then emotional work that I had to do, because this is about cutting my vision of what I thought the future was going to look like, this sort of cartoonish vision, my kids are going to go to the same liberal arts colleges and have more opportunities, all that stuff that had been planted in, I had to cut that. And it took a long time. And I'm not saying I know what's going to happen. I just say I now have a wider range of possible outcomes in my head. It could be better than I think. It could be worse. But I'm no longer attached to having it turn out in a certain way. I am now wide open to the fact it might turn out a bunch of different ways. And that took me just a lot of time to sort of process through. So what we've discovered in this, we call it, we just stole Kubler-Ross's stuff. We find that her 5 stages of grief are a very standard set of stages that we see people go through when they move from complete unawareness of this material, they come into it, come into anger, go into bargaining a lot. I have a whole basement full of bargaining purchases. If I just buy a Prius, this will all be okay. It's literally like that, right? And then there might be a depression stage, which is like, there's nothing I can do. And then finally moving into acceptance. But we have additional stages that we sort of toss in there. One of them is fear. It's kind of a stage. In fact, it's not a part of the stage. It might reappear at every moment along there, or anxiety, or peace like that. And that fear itself can be a good thing. Like when you're being chased by a bear, fear is a good thing. But there are also fear angles you can go down which become cul-de-sacs, where it's paralyzing. And so I found that I think it's okay wherever anybody is in that spectrum, wherever they are. I want to just try and hold compassion for where they are because I've seen something else. Wherever you start with this, you'll move through these stages. I haven't seen anybody just stay in one spot and get stuck there. This is just something, and it's okay now for me that people enter this material and have a progression of emotional responses they go through. And not everybody goes through them all. Some people start here and some people cycle through. I do, go back around a few times, a couple laps. So it's just part of it. And so I've become more and more aware of just how important it is to give people space to be where they are with this material. And most importantly, and this is a trick for anybody who has somebody out there that you're trying to explain this kind of material to, you will be 10 times more effective if you completely drop needing to change them from where they are. Just forget about it. And as soon as you do, it'll happen. This was my learning. As soon as I learned how to stop needing to change somebody from where they are, I was a lot more effective in interacting with them and transforming them. So when I was in my angry stage, I collected all these angry people. We had a little angry swap meet, It was called preaching to the choir, right? And I can see where people are with her now, and I don't come up to them and say, you've got to drop your anger. It's so much better over here in acceptance, She's like, no, I understand where you're at, and it's perfectly okay. And because of that, it's easier to help somebody move through that. It's easier to be with them both ways. And so it's a story of compassion and just allowing people to be where they are, because we're all going to move through this at our own pace. And we're all going to do it in the way we have to.
Chris, talk about the seminar for just a second, because that's perfect.
Oh, I'm going to take 20 seconds on this.
And then maybe one more question after that.
OK, and then one question in the back there. We are going to be giving a seminar. So Becca, raise your hand again. We've been dealing with this stuff together for a long time. The crash course is this 3.5-hour body of left brain, tour de force stuff. And in the seminars we give, we ask people to watch that, and then we don't spend any more time on it. The material we just talked about, and we talk about what do you do with this material. So I gave you a little tiny piece of it, but there's a lot of elements to that. And so we're giving a seminar. We do about 2 a year. Usually they're at Row. This spring one happens to be in New Paltz, New York. It's the weekend of April 17th, and it's a one-day seminar. And SUNY New Paltz, and it's on Sunday. And the steps I've personally taken around becoming more resilient with respect to how my house is heated. I have 4 ways of heating my house now instead of the oil burner we had when we moved in. I've got multiple ways of feeding myself. All of my meat comes from either I grow it or I know the person who does. I've got a very strong, resilient community that I interact with. All of these things are absolutely necessary, even though they're probably insufficient under a couple of scenarios. But the important part is that if, I took care of, let's think the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, my shelter, my warmth, my food, my physical security, those things, now that I did them, I actually haven't thought about them in quite a while. I did them, I put them on the shelf, gave me this peace of mind, so I didn't worry about them, and now I'm out doing what I do a lot more effectively. So I truly believe that strong communities are necessary, but they rest on strong individuals within those communities. With that,
I'd like to thank you very much.